My name's Glyn Pooley and I'd like to talk about art. This time my subject is presentation, a naked figure in art. There we are. So this is a long tradition, as you can see. It goes back on the left hand side there to, well, at least 40,000 years. A bit of a jump, I know, between the 40 and 25,000, but it's something which is fundamental to the creative process. The Venus of Hofels was found in Germany, and it is sculpted out of an old mammoth tusk. It's interesting how the figure has kind of been stylized and adapted. But even with these 40 to 25, 15 years, 15,000 years between these two, the Venus of Weldendorf, that's in Austria, you can see that there's certain similar characteristics. So yeah, there's been links to suggest, though, that these are symbols of fertility, of course, and connections with everything fruitful. But it's interesting how the artist has put the marks and the form together. In the one on the left, as well as the form that's been sculpted, these are relatively small pieces. They're only a few inches high. They've actually etched into it as well. So there's some drawing taking place. And as he said, when we think how old this is quite incredible. But what they're having is a kind of visceral connection with the object. And the same with the one on the right, which is made out of limestone. There's some real strong detailing in the head, which suggests, they could suggest braids or something like that. But so there's close observation, and it's this theme of kind of a balance between what we see in front of us, so close observation, and how we interpret the figure, what kind of thing that we want the figure to share with us, what we want the story to tell, if you like. And when we look through these images now, you'll see how artists are using different perspectives to tell this story. But also what's interesting is how they all link up. So those two there, and then when we start to see the first kind of rock painting was in the community or the society there, these are just created with this beautiful earth colors, which is just things which are just found at the bottom of the cave. But this coloration that we're looking at there is maybe something that we'll use in the life class, because again, artists have used this kind of coloration over the years. There's something about the connective quality of this kind of mark making that seems to lend itself to the life drawing. So we've jumped around from Germany to Austria. I know I'm moving quite quickly. Over to Australia, and now here to northwest India or Pakistan area, where we've got this lovely bronze is made. So this is a global phenomenon, I think, is what we're trying to get across here. This is described as a dancing girl, I suppose because of the decorations that they placed on her, is another aspect of what we can consider if we interpret our life model. Okay, we generally think of it as naked, but you'll see a number of artists kind of add different things to the form just to add to their narrative and add to their story. It's interesting, even at this stage, what they're kind of looking at in terms of what they're giving emphasis to. So you saw in the very early ones, of course, there was this great emphasis on the body, the sense of flesh, the size of the body. The head was not particularly predominant. Whereas in this one, of course, the limbs has changed. The size of the limbs are completely changed, and the head has become a little bit more prominent in it. So the aesthetics of the life figure seems to take on a certain kind of emphasis depending on where you're from, in terms of what you're seeing in front of you and what you're feeling about the other figures around you. So when we start to look at the more traditional Western art ones, you can see how certain kind of stereotypes were established, and then later on how they're kind of being broken down. So a lot of the Western art tradition goes back to like ancient Greece, this iconic way of portraying the figure, these marble sculptures, showing a mm, sense of aesthetic uh, connection, something that the figure has to do for us, if you like, in a way. They have to kind of have a certain presence, but they have to have a certain presence in a certain kind of way. Now, these are kind of archetypal images that artists just for a long time couldn't let go of. So we see it kind of repeated over and over. The figure on the right is of a warrior that is what they call a fallen warrior. So this is like a kind of marker sculpture that, it's a bit like you put a gravestone on a grave where this warrior fell, because there was an inscription on the base of the piece which describes the battle that this warrior was in. And imagine putting a headstone like that in the local cemetery. I don't think many could do it these days. But they're not sure, the historians, whether it is a specific person or whether it's a generic form. But these youthful figures of these warriors are called kuros, and it's because a number of them have been found there together. The female form one is interesting because the three-dimensionality of it is just incredible. Obviously it's got to work in, you can walk around that 360 degrees, and all the proportions are kind of in a sense of balance. And it is balance and aesthetic balance and spaces between limbs and things like that, which kind of have a certain kind of appeal. When we're looking at figures, sometimes we have to really understand a sense of proportion, but we also have to understand what artists do to that proportion. So if we jump from ancient Greek sculptures to Western art, you see you can see the connections, you can see the sense of how the figure is being portrayed in a similar kind of way, but you start to see a different kind of avenue being taken. In Western art, they usually emphasize this story aspect of it. So this concept of Venus that you just saw in that Greek sculpture and this Western art here, of course, it was a Roman invention, the goddess of Venus. The ancient Greeks had Aphrodite. By putting this story to it, it kind of adds to a certain kind of reading, which we got to be careful of. So it's not so become like a repeated prejudice. So trying to draw and paint what you actually see is something that we're going to try and practice. This image, I don't know if anyone's been to the Uffizi in Florence. It is really beautiful. Has kind of caught the Western arts artists' imagination for the last 500-600 years, mainly because of its link with what we just saw in ancient Greece, because it's a deep connection. The aspect of a little story going here, where on the left-hand side you've got the wind gods blowing Aphrodite in a shell to the shore, where she's greeted by this symbol of the spring on the right-hand side to be wrapped in it when she kind of lands. It gives you a kind of transcendent interpretation of the figure. It's something beyond the here and now. So the story becomes quite important. So think about that when you're actually making your life images in the class as well. Just kind of just have it in the back of your mind. What kind of story is this figure telling you, and then how you will share that in your portrayal of it. These archetypes, as you can see, have been backed up by some of the great artists and painters like Leonardo da Vinci, of course, who did a lot of work in analysing how the structure and the body was put together. Lots of dissections and things like that. Trying to understand what was going on below the skin. And even up to the 18th and 19th century, in the art schools or academies and places like that, they didn't draw from the figure, the live figure for quite a few years. You'd have to be there, they had a lot of experience before they let you into the live class. You'd be drawing from these plaster cast models, and these plaster cast models were of like just the kind of images that we've just looked at, the ancient Greek images. So they kept having repeating themselves in terms of trying to understand how the figure was, but because they were being shown a certain kind of figure over and over, they thought that had to be, and the only way to kind of portray it. So when people like Leonardo da Vinci make something like this, the Vitruvian Man, Vitruvius was a Roman architect who was kind of particularly interested in the building's aesthetic. It had to have practical elements to it, but it also had to kind of stand and operate in a space that had a human dimension that kind of elevated, had a kind of beauty, as well as a way of moving through that architectural space that had a kind of uplift. So there was an aesthetic value to it. So Leonardo da Vinci puts this down in this kind of form that artists then latch onto. So we've got to be careful about this, because when you're looking at your how to do life drawing books and things like that, they give you all these different kinds of measurements. So this is what Da Vinci's done here. The width of the arms stretched out is the same as from the top of the head to the bottom of the foot, etc. You know, the width of the chest only has to be a certain kind of size, and then it's broken down into equal forms and sizes. Now, when we're confronted with the model, you can pretty much guarantee that they won't match up totally to those aesthetics. But what we'll see is artists sort of coming somewhere between what they're seeing. Actually painting what they're seeing becomes quite late on, if you like, in the history of art. Mm. In Western art, you see it was there right at the beginning in the cave art, but then when the influence of the Greek art comes in, then it becomes more painting what you think you're seeing. Okay, so although it's got a certain kind of use in the mechanics of the body, we're more interested maybe in really start to look and see what's in front of us. Okay, so what it enabled uh, the great artists like Michelangelo to do, building on Da Vinci's measurements, etc., is produce very convincing objects like this. And if you've been to Florence and you've stood in front of it, it is tremendous. They are marvelous sculptural pieces. But it's interesting making a note of the length of the arms there, the size of the hands, the relative size of the head to the length of the body is taking on the Da Vinci kind of archetype for aesthetic reasons, how we kind of navigate that relationship with what's in front of us. But this piece has got elements of the ancient Greek, but it's also taking on those Leonardo specific measurements that we just kind of looked at. And when Michelangelo puts it into painting, you can see there's a two-dimensional version of that three-dimensional sculpture that he just created there. You see things like the head looks really kind of small there, doesn't it? So the aesthetic quality overrides what he would actually see before him. It's symbolic in a way, I suppose, is the easiest way to think about it. So it frees us up from that perspective. So if you're in front of the model and you want to think of it in terms of symbolism, feel free to do that. If you've got want to put a certain kind of interpretation on your model, you can as well. So it's kind of knowing that these avenues exist and give us the opportunity to explore. I'm going to introduce you just to some of the major painters that have kind of focused on the figure. And if you like what you see of that artist, I would say explore it a little bit further. Now, Titian, the Venetian artist, he painted the naked figure many times, often in the same guise of Greek or Roman mythology. But there's something captivating about his interpretation. And then other artists over the years just kind of repeat the kind of archetype of it, is what we're saying. So in this picture, of a young woman, the historians are not quite sure whether she was betrothed to be married and this was a gift to her husband, or she was a courtesan woman. But the symbols behind it, like her maids in waiting in the background are preparing her for something. They're getting sorting out her clothes or something like that, or looking for something. And she sits there all seductively with her roses in her hand, and the dog sitting on the bed, which is a symbol of fidelity in artistry and loyalty. So that's why they give it that kind of interpretation. But she gazes straight at us. So when you've got your model in front of you there, think about, are you having an active connection with them, or is it going to be passive? Are you going to observe them just as an object, or are you somehow going to be able to get to inside the presence of them? And that will depend to a degree on the position you take in relation to that model. Will you be able to see their face? Will you be able to see a sense of their inner world in relation to how the rest of the body is structured, and how the body is stanced can also add an element of reinforcing what their psychological state is, which is what you've got in images like this. This one I put in because it's in the National Gallery up in London, and it's just a fabulous painting. It's Rubens was a tremendously gifted, fluent artist, and it's not until you're in front of it, and this is quite a highly finished piece, that you see the freedom that he often paints his images with. His brush marks are very fluid, very organic, but he's using a biblical text here to out and to kind of show the muscular forms of the back of the figure, etc. But he's using light here now. This is in a more extreme way. There's a few other key artists haven't included here. So I'm just trying to pick through the time decade, the centuries really. So we mentioned light. Another example of an artist using light to create form is Caravaggio, around about this time as well. How the light hits the form and the impact that has. So, we'll be able to look at something from the sense of line, we'll be able to look at something from the sense of form, and we'll be looking at something from the sense of light, and they can kind of course, coalesce together. This other aspect that they artists use as well is just an element of drapery. That's another theme that just kind of offers a contrast to the flesh often. And as we've said, when we're making paintings or artworks or whatever, it fundamentally operates in terms of contrasts. Light creates dark, etc. Something smooth contrast to something rough, of course. And by enabling that like opportunity, you can get more depth and interest in your picture. Often with the drapery, it's about flow and it's about form, and then the muscular element or the flow of the female bodies you see kind of emphasizes and reiterates some of the flow and the form that's in the drapery. So it just gives it more strength. It just reinforces those elements in the figure. This one by Rubens as well. You can see they're going back to mythology, Venus, Bacchus, and Ceres, or Ceres. It's a way of sharing a bigger story uh, again, and that's the important thing to think of here. They're very kind of almost like manneristic, and there was a kind of whole movement in the 16 to 1700s called mannerism, whereby they're stretching the human shape and form feeling they want to give over. So you've got these very small heads. You got this flow of the body repeating itself and moving from one area to the other. But when an image portrayed like this at this kind of size, it looks kind of quite highly finished. But when you're in front of it, you see that it's not. It's really kind of loosely painted. But it's interesting to see some elements of coloration in this now. Which parts, if you like, are warm in tone coming towards us, and which parts are cool, like the shadowing area. And that's something we want to look at as well when we're making our image to add that extra bit of depth, as well as this sinuous form, the line and the spaces between the limbs, etc. Just to add that extra little bit of three-dimensionality by using very simple things like the red, the blue, and the neutral. That enables us to add that extra bit of depth. If we had a little bit more saturated color in there or something, again, operating in contrast, that will show the flesh in a different kind of light. That we'll see that more clearly in later images. But these artists are still doing the same thing all the time. Diego Velasquez, amazing Spanish artist. If you get to see his work, in the Prada, particularly in Madrid, it's absolutely fantastic. But this one is in the National Gallery because it came over to Britain, to Rugby in Yorkshire. That's why there's a Rugby Venus. They like calling them things like Venus, don't they? And having a little Cupid around them. Sensibilities, that enable them to exhibit them to a certain audience without shocking them so much, if you like. But this is almost a kind of moving on from that suggestion that we mentioned about mannerism, about changing the form. When we first look at it, it looks as if this figure can kind of lounge there on that soft bed. But when you really start to look at the proportions and that, her back would be in a very strange position, and that back would be very, very long. You know, it is a construct. It's a smooth flowing construct, as I said, which is added to by the flow of the drapery. Okay, just to kind of engage with a certain kind of aesthetic. And in opposition, the little Cupid hasn't got that same kind of flow. It's kind of upright and kind of static in that respect. So you get different kinds of feelings from these different objects by the way that they're kind of suggested. This one as well is given this kind of holding up the mirror to her beauty. But when we look at that figure, that face, we don't know if that's her really, or like similar kind of color hair. But if we were in front of that image, that would not be a reflection of her because the mirror is kind of pointing towards us, So we are engaged in this dialogue now. She is gazing straight at us via the mirror construct. So, like I was talking a little bit earlier about engagement with the figure, we'll think about that, how we have that kind of dialogue, and you can use all these kind of little tools or techniques to do it. It might be a good idea if you've got one to bring a little mirror, whether that be a little makeup mirror or something like that, because if you look at your figure in the mirror, it will quickly show you any kind of drawing abnormalities that you're not happy with. So that's a useful tool. But it's also interesting if you got a bigger mirror that you could place near the figure as well, or relationship. to it, so that you get these multiple viewpoints. It all adds interest, it all adds perspective, and in that case, it's also a good drawing aid. Then we jump to the 1800s. Now, this tradition of painting the figure like this, there was lots of artists that did this now, because this was part of standard practice in the art schools, painting the life model after they painted all these plaster casts. But what's interesting, you start to see how these great artists are they're building on each other's work. And I say that in the class often, don't I? We don't have to keep reinventing the wheel for certain things. We can kind of refer back to how someone else has done it, for the reasons they've done it, the impact they've got, and then you can kind of use that. Jean-Dominique Ong, of course, he has got this really strong elongated back again, like we saw in the Blasquith. We've also got strange things happening, like this leg wouldn't be part of this body if it was actually, as you see. See, where does that knee, where does that thigh radiate into? Does it come out of that pillow? No. But when we first look at it, we think there's a cohesive whole to it. So the twisting forms, they're adding elements to forms, but they're kind of holding them together. It's just about holding them together, because they're building on the connection that they had with that Leonardo Vitruvius man diagram. Okay, the human eye, well, because we're pretty familiar with the figure, will allow quite a lot of leeway in terms of thinking that that figure can still operate traditionally in space as get up, walk around, stand, even though when the artist portrays it something like this, we fill in the gaps, if you like, from that point of view. So the artist then is free to use their aesthetic fun to kind of suggest something else. If in this case it's a certain kind of sensuality, because it's an odalisque. That's odalisque is like a Turkish concubine, something like that. This time they were interested in what's happening. Everyone's always interested in what's not happening in their back garden, really, that part of the world. The audience, of course, shocked initially, but then it quickly gets consumed into the genre. Beautifully painted, as you can see, smooth within an inch of his life with Jean-Dominique Ong. Great draftsman, the line and form, etc. So if you like that element, have a look at Jean-Dominique Ong. Classical art of that period. And if you want a good example of these kinds of artworks, of course, just go to Paris, go to the Louvre, and you'll see lots of them. Big figures, lots of figures, drawn and painted incredibly well. The difference is, of course, in the story, the decoration, and the connection, like the face of the object, the person. So if you can get those elements into your piece as well, then you add that extra dimension to it. Okay? So something a little bit more simple in a way, or accessible. We're moving in that direction, which is great. I can hear you say. Degas, the Impressionist artists. We can see that the perspective has changed here now. So from these iconic images that we've seen, these aloof images, these symbol images, if you like, we're now moving to something a little bit more realistic in terms of capturing the figure doing something they might do every day. All right, she's kneeling on the ground, so it's not so grandiose. They also, of course, Degas did lots of his ballet dancers, of course, and other figures, but he did people like washing in their bath, etc., which we'll have a look at in a second. But things that were more normal, more natural, more down to earth were being captured now. But it's interesting to look at this. I put this in because it's something that you could have a go at next week. You could use your pencil in a cross-hatching way. You can see the cross-hatching marks there. Then you could kind of just reinstate that extra strength with the black charcoal, and then you could bring out with a bit of red pastel, a little bit of the surroundings. Now it's intriguing that this is done in 1888. We went right back to the beginning, to prehistoric times, and this was the same kind of coloration they were using. An artist used something called sanguine, which was like this reddy brown kind of material. You get it in your pastels as a, like I said, a quick step into creating the human form. Because when we look at our flesh, look at the color of it, it's often found in it. So just by simply having something neutral colors, something red, something black, and then revealing the light can create that much three-dimensionality on it. The reason why he's cross-hatched, he likes to work like that, is because he can offer directional qualities. So you can create that can reinforce form, and you can also give the impression of light bouncing off surfaces. Say down on the arm on the right hand side, there and there. The other thing you might just notice, and we'll see in a second as well, is just the incorporation of a few little hints of blue. This is all about balancing and contrast and opposites. So yeah, after the bath, a woman drying herself by Degas, those things that we just mentioned. He loved painting in pastels, particularly later on. His eyesight struggled a little bit. Initially, for earlier pictures were quite detailed oil paintings and quite small, some of them. And so there was a lot of emphasis in draftsmanship. But pastel again is great because it gives you an immediacy and a freedom. So chalks or pastel, which we can use next week, give us that quick step into it. But it's interesting to see that cross-hatching technique being used. So that's a possibility. This is a worked up version of that one that we just saw there. This would be like the early preparation. And he would start this one in a similar kind of way. And then he could build on the subtleties of the colors over the top of it. And you get to see the lovely sensitivities and delicacies of his marks, with a contrast between some cool reds here and some warm neutrals or some warm ochres on the main aspect of the body picked up by highlight, and then moving towards the blue end of the spectrum towards the shadows. And if you can define that quickly in front of the model, then you can work it up a little bit, like something like this. And this is Toulouse-Lautrec. So we're bringing brown paint. So you could do something like this, quite quickly. We'll do some quick poses as well as some longer ones. And it's interesting how the artist here, he's created the form quite quickly with a brush. He also, Toulouse-Lautrec, does a lot with chalks and pastels, but he's very fluid with his brush, just to kind of give you a suggested outline. Then he just enables the figure to kind of float in and out of space. So the paper's beautiful. These old handmade papers sometimes have so much nuance and textures into them. But because it's brown, it's given us a lovely mid-tone. So then all you've got to be concerned with is the light tone and some dark tone. But also you notice just beyond the form, there's a little bit of blue again, just being picked up. So cool blue, because it's cool, will recede. So you can contrast that with warmer colors. So if you put some warmer element in a picture, that can come towards us, and the blue can very quickly push something away. So it's just simple basics that you can do to capture a lot of information from your model when you're there, as in this one. Sometimes we forget the interaction between the space just outside the model and the model themselves. And just this extra little bit of blue, this little cool, just around the outside of the figure, pushes that space away so that the rest can kind of come towards us. When it's more red, whether it's top of a head there or on a foot, wherever, that's coming towards us. This is a nice way of doing it as well. If you've either got chalks, white chalks on a neutral paper, or if you use white gouache, a little bit of body color, something like that in your paint, your whole figure could be painted as a kind of highlight shape, and then elements of tone could just kind of push it back. But it gives you a lovely three-dimensional quality, and you can see how something like this would have been done really quickly as well. And Toulouse-Lautrec in his story in the Moulin Rouge and places like that, he often worked quick in those dance floors. There's lots of stories. Looking how we move into the 20th century, And then you've got people like Henry Matisse. This is moving in terms of, remember, many, seems like a long time ago now, we looked at the Fauvist movement, this movement towards colour, etc. This is the early kind of stages of it. So let's have a look at a few little interpretations. This is a good example of the emphasis on the light, isn't it? We got light against dark. So picking out the light forms and the light aspects of the figure can then reveal the sinuous nature of the form in the dark aspect. Looking at the links between the lights and darks as well, we've got a very subtle blue and a very subtle red. The red is moving towards the pink and the blue is moving towards the kind of cerulean kind of color, heightening what we call a color vibrational value. And this is in the light of the experiments that the post-impressionists did. This just lifts up the figure. It's become quite trendy in the 20th century, 21st century, to make very colorful images, and you see them all over the internet. They just grab your attention, basically, and that's what's happened, of course, with the Impressionists. We're drawn to them, but unless they're done with sensitivity, they quickly overwhelm your senses, and you can only look at them for so long, and then you pass on to the next one. So they're fantastic stuff for the internet, which is high turnover over and over. But you know, art is best appreciated when you're stood in front of it, when you get a chance to actually take it in with all those sensitivities. And as you probably know, some of you photograph some of your work, some pictures which are kind of mediocre look fabulous via the TV screen and the internet, and vice versa. Pictures which have got very subtle elements, delicacies, don't convert into the digital kind of format. But that being said, we understand what these artists are doing. We understand the kind of abilities of these paints to get that kind of information out, and then we choose to use it or not, and how we choose it specifically. Right? But in this one, with the early 20th century, we're looking at that contrast between the light and dark. And interpretation in the 20th century. So this famous one, looked at a number of times with Picasso. Now he's taken on the concept of cubism. We all know that, like looking at things of many dimensions simultaneously from lots of different directions. Influenced by African art, African masks, etc. We could sort of link that in tenuously with those prehistoric images that we kind of saw, these archetypals, also imagery that we saw in Greece as well. So if you want to paint the model looking like, so be it, give it a go. If you want to put a mask on them and things like that, the freedom is there for you. Maybe you don't want to show them straight away, but then again, feel brave. Just tell them you're giving them an African tradition, or a Haitian tradition, or any of the other traditions that we've looked at. It's your interpretation, which is you can kind of do now because we're in the 21st century. You just say you're just experimenting. Right? So anyway, this is Picasso giving us the opportunity to do that now from the prism and the distant lens of what he was trying to do there. You might also want to explore the model on a slightly longer pose from a number of different positions. So you start off from position 1, then you move your easel to position 2, and then maybe position 3, and you just overlap those images one on top of the other. That's interesting. And there's an artist that we'll look at in a minute towards the end who kind of now moved in that direction quite a lot. It just gives you an opportunity to explore the figure and the model. And then we look at here, this is Sonia Delaunay. She was part of a movement called Orphism. As you can see, is influenced by Fauvist as well. So your color interpretation can be subjective, can be free. And when it's saturated colors like this, you see how engaging they can kind of be. The strongest ones, kind of pictures that have got deep color saturation, can elevate you as well. But she was interested in pattern and movement and energy and how things flow through space. So you get this interpretation of this figure where the lady is kind of, she's not just sat on a cushion or something like that. See a bit of a cushion here, but she's also floating in her background. Her background becomes part of her, and the kind of designs that she was interested in the background, of course, are then echoed in the model. So remember I talked about drapery and how that was used in classical kind of painting to emphasize the flow of the model and re-emphasize the structure of the model. Delaunay's done it here. Her backgrounds are kind of angular, so the figure itself is kind of angular, and they link up then, and they give a completely different kind of feeling, okay, as well. So that's another thing you can explore. You can explore pattern in your figure. So when you look at how the light hits the figure, and you might be interested in the structure and the patterns that the light pattern creates on that natural form, and then you can re-emphasize that with structural patterns in your background as well, to basically say, well, this is what I'm interested in this interpretation of the figure. As I say, I'm introducing you to some of these figures, artists that specialized in this kind of work. And you got Egon Schiele here, who hit the art world like a rocket and then unfortunately left it in the same way. He didn't live very long, but his work is so striking. He's an Austrian artist. He just totally absorbed himself in the figure and his relationship with it. Some of these extreme artists, of course, they went really deep with their models, if you know what I mean. Like, so I'm not saying to do that next week with a model. You have to get to know them, but there was a real intimacy there, and that produced some very strong kind of imagery as well. So yeah, Sheila is one of those, but it's interesting to see how his work in this one, of course, it's just almost like showing the figure in silhouette. So that's another way. That's what I thought is another way you can tackle the figure as well. There's some lovely little line drawings and the subtlety and acute observation of things like perspective here. But you can see how he's just broken the foot down into a certain kind of shape, the knee, the thigh, etc. And then just painted the overall same kind of coloration that we've seen in the prehistoric paintings again, etc. in it, and just emphasizing a few little darker areas, but offering a kind of sensuality, which for Sheila, so another one, was seen as so kind of outrageous to the Vienna audience that they banned a lot of his work. But anyway, he just persisted, carried on. But it's interesting here because you get this kind of combination of strong lines, very definitely describing the form, and then that counterpoint of some very strong color areas just around the figure as a contrast. And this is a motif that he does uses quite often. So having that little bit of drapery or just offering it up as color can be a very useful way of adding some information to the internal part of the figure. He's just picked up that balance again between some parts which are red and some parts which are blue there. But the use of the certain kind of blue in the background, and that greeny blue at the top of the scar, it just sets the mood, it sets the kind of atmosphere and the feeling. It adds to the drama as well. So you can see yourself as a filmic artist when you're using the narrative of the figure here. And this is another good example. Just this orange form around the figure, this drapery, but drapery, but it's just an orange shape, and gives us a lovely contrast to the linear quality of his paint, his line there, and the angularity again that he paints the figures in. When you see them close up, they've got just a sharpness aligned to them, so they're acutely observed, but they're also very subtle as well and sensitive, particularly in the face or the the internal aspect of the figure. You feel a person is really inhabiting these figures when you're in front of them. And I think because he painted them in such provocative poses, some thought they were pornographic, because he had this ability to get this sensitivity, that's the thing which arrested their audience. They just kind of shook, he just shook them there. That this was just too visceral for them, too emotive. But if you get an element of that in your life drawing, world's your oyster now. Go for it. As this other artist as well, intriguing, Modigliani. He painted some beautiful nudes, and he painted some beautiful portraits as well. Unfortunately, short life. He died of tuberculosis, but he'd been ill for a lot of his life. But he was one who lived that really close archetypal model artist relationship, and it kind of shows. What is interesting looking at this figure is that in those earlier archetypal pictures that we saw, whether it be Titian, whether it be the ancient Greek, you know, whether it be Leonardo da Vinci or whether it be Michelangelo, we saw these very small faces, didn't we, on these very elongated figures. Well, with Modigliani here, we're seeing a large face on a figure that is sensuous, but it's that emphasis on the face with Modigliani, with a living presence in there that adds to the sensuous nature of the figure. So he's kind of turned that up on its head in that respect. But he's interested in certain Greek art, but it's more what they call a cycladic art, where they kind of smoothed out all these edges, but they kind of focused on the erotic, if you like, element of those forms, those flowing forms, the way the eyes and the nose and the mouth, these ovals, these repeated ovals in an oval head. It just gives us different kinds of sensuality to the figure, and this becomes an archetypal element that he uses in his work. But although he didn't sell hardly anything when he was alive and couldn't move these for love or money, after, of course, then they become very sought after and go for considerable amounts. And he influenced the other artists as well, whether it be later, Picasso and people like that. You can see there's links there with some Picasso imagery, but deep engagement again. Matisse, I've just put this in for different kinds of interpretation. Matisse, yeah, he's got all the flow and the form of the body. He's outlined it with these big, black, bold lines here, but you've got this decorative quality just around it as well. But there's a consistency of mark, a consistency of shape and form. A few little decorations, the blue eyes, blue necklace. When you repeat something, you emphasize it. But it goes to show how bold you might want to be in your use of your paint next week as well. It doesn't have to be just a fine pencil drawing, even a fine charcoal drawing. If you then want to make it really bold and strong, feel free. You can do that. You can look at them. You really emphasize the shape, and this figure's all painted more or less in one color, and it's almost really kind of flat as well. So that's an interpretation. These are opportunities to emphasize the decorative in this instance. And this is a later Matisse. You might want to do it out of collage picture next week. You might want to cut up shapes and forms. That's interesting. That'd be interesting as well. Of course, later on in his life, Matisse was quite ill, so he couldn't do that. But these are large images that he created because he painted the form so much. He knew much about how it kind of was put together, etc. He could just use his scissors and create these sinuous kind of cutouts, and then his assistants would assemble them on the walls of his hospital room and his bedroom and make them. So, this is another opportunity. If your life drawing is not working out as you want it to be, cut it up with a pair of scissors into a shape of an arm and a leg and stick those together, and there you go. You've been created and reused what you started with. And that's the thing. Keep that creative flow open and interesting. Now, this is an English artist, Jenny Saville. As I said, I'm just introducing you to some of these artists. She is probably the foremost figurative artist in the UK at the moment. She has explored the human figure in an interesting, tremendous way. I- It's she's researched how the figure is being kind of twisted, manipulated, the different perspectives that we've looked at, the human figure, the female figure, etc. Obviously, being a female artist, she's seeing the whole thing from, a very different perspective to those archetypal Western men painters who we saw early on. Some people find her work kind of fairly difficult to take because it is very, very strong and bordering on disturbing, because she did make a lot of images of people manipulating their bodies, surgery, etc., like that. But she was very interested in the fleshiness of the figure. These paintings are large pictures. And this was painted very early on in her career. She's like early 20s when she did this, and this is like a 6 foot painting. Again, you'll really appreciate them when you're in front of them, the quality of them. But she's exploring the figure from lots of different perspectives here. She explores. This is an early one, so this is kind of highly finished. She's quite an expressionist painter for quite a while as well. So how the paint operates within the space of the flesh is something which she kind of has mastered, and you only get that when you're in front of them. But yeah, if you're interested in contemporary, good quality figurative art, Jenny Saville is right up there with them. It's one to have a look at, definitely. And it's interesting because she's a very young artist here, June 23. And then you got this archetypal painting by Lucien Freud, of course, who was seen as one of the great 20th century figurative artists. And I got a feeling he was probably influenced by her. He must have seen her work in terms of the model he's chosen here, and the fleshiness and the size of the figure. This was quite a famous picture at the time, of course, because just after Thatcherism and all that had gone on, and what the state of the country was, etc. This was different connotations. People could read this from a sociological and a position. But that being said, he's really interested in flesh, colours, the relationships of nuance, of tone, and acute observation. But when you're in front of these again, it's about the textures. So you might want to explore texture next week and the build-up of these paints. All right, something like this is an oil painting. It's quite large. It takes quite a long time to make, a number of months, possibly into years. But he's just looking at and he's building up and building up. But there's ways of creating texture, we've seen through our classes, that you might want to explore different avenues to capture different things. But this is so far away from the ancient Greek and the Michelangelo image as well. It's interesting, a sleeping figure on this couch that kind of wraps itself around her, which reinforces her shape and her form again. And I say, when you're in front of them, is ability to observe very clearly and closely does take on another dimension. So well worth looking at some of his work as well. And he paints lots of male figures as well. And one of the best, I would say, of his paintings is a self-portrait he did when he was 70, stood there with his easel and his brush. Honest, very, very honest. He was quite a brave painter, but he really engaged with the model deeply again. So from those realms back to the normal, more normal for us. I've just put these two in at the end just so that we can see what possibly we could do more achievable, if you like. On the left, we got the simple picture with some, say, watercolor or a bit of something like that, ink, just light washes, and then a line where we just got a nice observed line, but it's a lovely, pleasing image, but it's accessible. And on the right hand side here, you've got the drawing has been done, and then we've got collage over the top. So this is a combination of collage and elements of paint. We've seen decorative elements in the pictures coming up that we've looked at. Again, collage and paint and form is another way of stepping into this model. I'm just conscious of time.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification.